Breaking just moments ago, the President of the United States telling me he thinks Republicans will surprise everyone in the midterms. And he's ramping up his attacks on Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, telling me that the Fed is the biggest threat he faces. Part 2 of my exclusive interview with President Trump is just minutes away. The president is going to dive into that Mueller probe. He's going to talk about Saudi Arabia, and we're going to find out what really happened between him and Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. Before all that, I have an all-star panel to dissect what we just saw. Joining me right now on set, Forbes Media Chairman and Editor-in-Chief Steve Forbes, and National Taxpayers Union Senior Fellow Mattie Duppler. Good to have you both here. I'm starting with you, Steve. He thinks, we could see a bit of a surprise. Typically, history suggests that it's hard for the current party in favor to be able to take the midterms, but there's a lot of things that's happened, including the Kavanaugh situation, that might actually cause people to be very motivated to get out to vote. Do you agree with it?
The best thing the president has going for him is his opposition. They always overplay their hand. You saw that with Elizabeth Warren and being 1/1000th of Native American. By that criteria, we were all Native Americans. And so
kind of makes you wonder why she took the DNA test, right?
I think she thought. I think she thought she was going to ace the thing, and leave that aside.
All right.
But in terms of the midterms, the key is going to be in the next 3 weeks. Who motivates their base the most? This is where I wish the Republicans, talking about the economy, would talk more specifically about tax cuts, not just making them permanent. People don't know what that means. Talk about new tax cuts, new rate cuts, new payroll tax cuts. Say we gave you a Christmas present last December, we're going to give you another one.
Well,
you could give us a majority this
I hear
December.
you, and I like tax cuts too. But that said, I also like to be able to pay the bills. And right now we got $21.6 trillion worth of debt, which is something, Mattie, that the president talked about there. Yeah. And he said, look, he wants to get to this. He couldn't do it right away because you have to pay off a few friends in the other side, but he explained, and he wanted to build up the military. But this is part of his long-term plan. Can we afford more tax cuts like Steve wants?
Trish, let me tell you, I was so excited to hear the president talk about fiscal responsibility, music to my ears, because we should always be able to afford a tax cut for hardworking Americans. The question is whether or not Washington is too busy spending those taxpayer dollars. And the president is right. We have seen way too much spending, both under his view and the previous administration and the administration before that. This is a problem that precedes Donald Trump in the White House, but it doesn't have to be here when he leaves. He could implement spending reform that could actually make a dent in the federal deficit. And when we saw deficit numbers released yesterday, what we saw was that spending increased at a rate 2 percentage points higher than what revenues increased at. So it's very obvious the math is right there. We have a spending problem, not a revenue problem.
So what are you thinking right now, Mattie, for midterms? Or people feel good about themselves and the economy right now. That's all on the positive side. But sometimes when people are feeling good, they're not necessarily going to go out to the ballot boxes.
You're right. I mean, Trish, you hit it on the head. Americans are feeling better now than they were a year ago, than they were 2 years ago. And Steve mentioned this. We need Republicans out there talking to Americans and reminding them that they feel better off because of actions Republicans took last year, particularly when it comes to tax reform, regulatory reform, getting government out of the way so that Americans could once again live the lives that they intended to live. They're being able to plan for their families. They're being able to run their businesses the way they intended without government telling them otherwise. But they need to be reminded that what's at stake. And fortunately, Democrats have been doing a good job of that. They've been very clear that they are intent on taking away the tax cuts the minute they get power here in Washington. So Republicans need to remind voters what's at stake.
Well, and you heard the president talk about, I brought up the gender gap issue, and you heard him talk about the importance of economic security and how that is an issue for women. And he did, kind of spell that out pretty simply, that if Republicans lose this round, then, well, taxes probably will go higher. And some of the things that you've seen from an economic standpoint that have benefited the economy would be challenged. Let me turn to the Fed for a minute. Steve, what did you think of that? He said the Fed is the biggest threat he faces right now.
Well, the threat isn't the interest rate hike we're going to get in December. The markets have known that for months or a couple next year. The real danger to the Fed is when they use the word overheat, when they think the economy is too prosperous and they want to slow it down because they think prosperity causes inflation. Economies are made up of individuals. If you get a pay raise, you don't feel you're overheating. If you grow 5% instead of 3%, oh, I'm getting a temperature. So it's preposterous. The Fed should not be trying to control the economy. Let free people and free markets control it.
We haven't
and
had
stop
any
controlling
inflation,
interest
right? Like, there's been no inflation. I mean, we're getting a little bit now, a little bit, but I'm kind of welcoming it because it's been a while.
Well, inflation, real inflation, comes from bad monetary policy, not a prosperous economy. People doing better is not bad for the economy.
Right, and it's still relatively tame. So we'll see what Jerome Powell winds up doing in all this. Steve, good to see you.
Best thing about Powell is he's not an economist, so maybe there's hope.
Yeah, there you go. Mattie, good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
We're going
Trish.
to get back to the president right now. Coming up, part 2 of my